For 200 years, they said it. Greece was European. Africa had no role. When anyone argued otherwise, the scholarship came down hard. Careers, books, institutions all deployed to close the debate. The ancient DNA reopened it. Harvard's Iosif Lazaridis published in Nature in 2017. He showed that the Minoans and Mycenaeans were Near Eastern migrants, not native Europeans. Their dominant paternal haplogroup, E1b1b, traces to East Africa 26,000 years ago. Compared to modern Black American DNA, the haplogroup data shows a direct ancestral link. E1b1a in Black American men and E1b1b in ancient Greek men are sister lineages, diverging from the same East African ancestor roughly 35,000 years ago, before any civilization existed anywhere. One line went west into West Africa, one went north into the Aegean. Both came from the same man. In Africa, the civilization used to justify slavery. The people slavery built. Same ancient tree, same root. Drop a comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe. Let's begin with what the science actually established, starting with the most important ancient DNA study of the Greek world ever conducted. In August 2017, Dr. Iosif Lazaridis of Harvard Medical School, working alongside colleagues from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, the University of Washington, and more than a dozen other institutions, published a landmark paper in the journal Nature. The title was precise and unassuming: Genetic Origins of the Minoans and Mycenaeans. The implications were neither. The team had extracted and sequenced genome-wide data from 19 ancient individuals. Minoans from burial sites on the island of Crete, Mycenaeans from the shaft graves and tomb complexes of mainland Greece, and neighboring individuals from southwestern Anatolia. These were the genetic blueprints of the people who built the first advanced European civilization, the Minoans, who flourished on Crete from roughly 2600 BCE, built multi-story palace complexes at Knossos and Akrotiri, invented Europe's first writing system, and produced art of stunning sophistication before any mainland Greek culture existed. The Mycenaeans, who dominated mainland Greece from around 1600 BC, are the civilization Homer wrote about, the world of Agamemnon, the Trojan War, the shaft graves at Mycenae filled with gold. They wrote in Linear B, the earliest deciphered form of Greek. These were the genetic blueprints of the people at the origin of Western civilization as Europe has always defined it. And what did those blueprints show? Between 62% and 86% of both Minoan and Mycenaean ancestry traced back to Neolithic farmers who had migrated to the Aegean from Anatolia, what is now Turkey, thousands of years before the Bronze Age. These were not indigenous European people. They were migrants from the Near East, from what is now Turkey and the surrounding region, the same zone of the ancient world that produced the first farming societies, the first cities, the first written records. The genetic foundation of ancient Greece was Near Eastern, not European in any pure or original sense. The Mycenaeans had an additional component. Between 10% and 20% of their ancestry came from the Eurasian steppe, the same Bronze Age herders, whose migrations carried Proto-Indo-European language across Europe. This is the ancestry associated with the eventual emergence of the Greek language itself, as one branch of the vast Indo-European family that also produced Sanskrit, Latin, Persian, and most modern European tongues. As lead author Lazaridis stated directly after the study's publication, the Greeks have always been a work in progress, in which layers of migration through the ages added to, but did not erase, the genetic heritage of the Bronze Age populations. Not a pure, isolated European civilization, a layered, migrant-built, Near Eastern-anchored civilization. That is what the DNA showed. That is what the history books had not taught. But the finding that directly connects ancient Greek DNA to Black American DNA is not in the autosomal admixture percentages. It is in the haplogroup data. It is in the deep paternal lineages that go far below the Bronze Age, far below Mycenae and Knossos, all the way back to the oldest traceable human migrations in existence. the Y chromosome haplogroup that appears most prominently in both ancient and modern Greek men, accounting for approximately 20 to 30% of Greek male paternal lineages, depending on region, with the highest concentrations in the Balkans and southern mainland Greece, is haplogroup E1b1b. This haplogroup originated in East Africa approximately 26,000 years ago. It subsequently spread northward into Northeast Africa, into the Horn of Africa, across the Saharan corridors into North Africa, and then through multiple migration events during the Neolithic and earlier into the Near East and eventually into Europe. The E1b1b subclade, known as EV13, is the most common E lineage in Europe today, reaching its highest frequencies in Kosovo at around 45%, and showing significant concentrations throughout the Balkans, Greece, and southern Italy. The presence of E1b1b in ancient Mycenaean and Iron Age Greek remains has been confirmed in genetic analyses, and the haplogroup is a persistent, deeply established feature of Greek paternal ancestry across 4,000 years of documented history. Now here's the connection to Black American DNA. The dominant Y chromosome haplogroup in Black American men is haplogroup E1b1a, not E1b1b, the lineage prominent in Greece, but its sister branch on the same ancient tree. Both E1b1a and E1b1b are descendants of haplogroup M2 which emerged in East Africa roughly 35,000 years ago. Both are branches of haplogroup E, which itself originated in Africa over 70,000 years ago and is the most common Y chromosome haplogroup on the African continent. Here's what this means in plain terms. The paternal haplogroup most associated with Black American ancestry and the paternal haplogroup most associated with ancient Greek ancestry are sister lineages. They share a common East African ancestor who lived approximately 35,000 years ago, before farming existed, before cities existed, before any civilization existed anywhere on Earth. One branch of that ancient East African man's descendants moved west across the African continent over tens of thousands of years, eventually becoming the dominant paternal lineage of West Africa, including the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Mandinka, and the Congo, and then through the transatlantic slave trade, the core of Black American ancestry. The other branch moved north out of Africa through the ancient Near East and eventually into the Aegean world, where it became one of the defining paternal signatures of ancient and modern Greece. If you drew the human Y chromosome family tree and found the common ancestor of Black American men and ancient Greek men, you would draw a line to East Africa 35,000 years ago. You would place that ancestor in the African continent, before Greece, before civilization, at the root. Before we go further, if you're new here, subscribe right now. We trace the genetic connections that history buried. This one goes deeper than anything we've covered before. Subscribe, and let's keep going. Now let's talk about what this means for the debate that has defined the cultural politics of Western history for 2 centuries. In 1987, Cornell University professor Martin Bernal published Black Athena, The Afroasiatic Roots of Classical Civilization. His central argument was not biological, it was historical and linguistic. Bernal argued that from roughly 2100 BCE onward, Greek civilization was substantially shaped by cultural and demographic influence from Egypt and the Phoenician world of the Near East, that the ancient Greeks themselves, including Herodotus, Plato, and Pythagoras, acknowledged their debt to Egypt openly and repeatedly in their own writings, that approximately 40% of the Greek vocabulary derived from ancient Egyptian and West Semitic roots. And critically, that 18th century and 19th century European scholars had deliberately dismantled the ancient model of Egyptian influence on Greece and replaced it with what he called the Aryan model, a purely European, purely Indo-European origin story, constructed for explicitly racial and political reasons, to provide an untainted European genealogy for a civilization being used to justify colonial empire. The classical Greeks themselves, Bernal argued, knew nothing of this Aryan model. They did not see their culture as original or self-created. They saw themselves as students of Egypt, of Phoenicia, of the older civilizations to the south and east. Herodotus wrote that the names of nearly all the Greek gods came from Egypt. Plato spent years studying in Egypt and wrote about it. Pythagoras is said to have studied in Egypt and Babylon before returning with his mathematics. The ancient model, the original Greek understanding of their own origins, placed Africa and the Near East at the center of the story. The academic response to Bernal was enormous, sustained, and frequently disproportionate in its hostility. Classical scholars published entire books dedicated to refuting him. The debate filled academic journals for a decade. Some of the critique was legitimate and scholarly. Some of it was institutional defensiveness protecting a version of history that had been carefully constructed for ideological purposes. The ancient DNA evidence does not fully resolve Bernal's specific linguistic and cultural arguments, and those remain genuinely contested in ways that DNA cannot adjudicate. What it has done is confirm his foundational premise in biological terms, more ancient and more precise than anything he himself proposed. The 2017 Lazaridis study proved that the people who built Minoan and Mycenaean civilization were not indigenous Europeans. They were Near Eastern migrants whose deepest paternal haplogroup, E1b1b, traces its ultimate origin to East Africa over 26,000 years ago. Lazaridis himself, reflecting on the findings, stated that Greek civilization represented layers of migration that added to but never erased the foundational Bronze Age genome. That genome was itself built on Near Eastern foundations, with deep African roots in its haplogroup lineages. The Greek genome is not African in any simple modern racial sense, but at the deepest level at which DNA can be read, it shares a root with the African continent. And so does the Black American genome. The same root, the same ancient East African ancestor, two branches of the same tree that grew 35,000 years before the first stone of any Greek temple was cut. There is another dimension to this story that deserves careful attention: the documented, historical, physical presence of African people in ancient Greece. Because the genetic connection operates at the level of haplogroups and deep time. Ancient, abstract, 35,000 years removed from any living person's experience. But the African presence in classical Athens was recent and concrete, visible, recorded, depicted in art on objects that have survived 2,500 years and are sitting in museums right now. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York holds one of the most significant collections of ancient Greek pottery in the world. Among those vessels are Janiform Cantharoi, two-faced wine cups. They were produced in Athens between 520 BCE and 490 BCE at the absolute height of the classical period. They join an African male head with a Greek female head on a single vessel. These were not obscure or marginal objects. They were produced in significant numbers, used at symposia, the formal drinking gatherings that were among the most important social institutions of Athenian elite life. Scholars and philosophers and citizens drank from vessels bearing African faces while discussing justice, beauty, and the nature of the good life. The African presence at the table of classical Athens was not metaphorical. It was literal. It was ceramic. It has survived. The American classical scholar Frank Snowden Jr. of Howard University, in his foundational 1970 work Blacks in Antiquity, documented African figures across Greek literary, artistic, and historical sources with meticulous and exhaustive precision. His evidence came not from ideology, but from primary sources: the actual texts, the actual pottery, the actual archaeological record. The playwright Aeschylus featured Ethiopian characters in his tragedies. Sophocles and Euripides did the same. African comic masks have been recovered from classical period sites, showing that African characters appeared not only in high tragedy, but in popular comedy, in the broadest and most widely attended theatrical form in Athenian public life. The legendary warrior Memnon, an Ethiopian king, son of the dawn goddess Eos, who came to the defense of Troy, was depicted on Greek pottery by the master painter Exekias around 535 BCE in the same heroic register as Achilles himself. In Greek mythology, the greatest mortal warrior of the age met his defining confrontation with an African king. That is not a footnote. It is one of the central dramatic scenes of the entire tradition. Homer's Odyssey describes Eurybates, Odysseus' most trusted herald, as dark-skinned and woolly-haired, and names him as the companion Odysseus valued above all others. African people were in ancient Greece as traders, as enslaved people, as mythological heroes, as athletes, as students of philosophy. The philosopher Epicurus counted an Ethiopian among his disciples. Images of Africans appear on Cyprus from as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described Ethiopians as the most just of all peoples and among the longest-lived humans on Earth, a description that reads, through the lens of modern genetics, as an ancient intuition about what we now know scientifically, that Africa holds the oldest, most genetically diverse, most ancient human lineages on the planet. Now let's put the full picture together, because the connection between Black American DNA and ancient Greek DNA operates simultaneously at two very different levels, and both of them matter. At the ancient haplogroup level, the dominant paternal lineage in Black American men and the dominant African origin paternal lineage in ancient and modern Greek men are sister branches of the same East African haplogroup E, which dates to approximately 35,000 years before present. The common ancestor of Black American E1B1A paternal lineages and Greek E1B1B paternal lineages lived in Africa before any civilization, any city, any piece of writing, any recorded human history existed anywhere on Earth. He is not a metaphor. He is a real man, identifiable in the genetic record, datable to approximately 35,000 years before present, located in East Africa, and from his sons, two branches of the human Y chromosome tree grew, one westward across Africa into what would become West Africa and eventually the African diaspora, and one northward out of Africa into the Near East and eventually into the Aegean world, where it became one of the defining paternal signatures of ancient and modern Greece. That is a biological fact, measurable, replicable, confirmed across multiple laboratories, multiple data sets, multiple published studies. At the historical level, the civilization that 19th century European scholars constructed as the pure, untouched, racially European origin point of Western civilization was built by Near Eastern migrants whose deepest paternal lineage traces to East Africa. It was never genetically isolated from the African world. It interacted directly, repeatedly, and documentably with African people throughout its classical period. It depicted African faces on its wine cups, featured African heroes in its greatest plays, and preserved in its own historical texts the Greek acknowledgement that Egypt and the African world had shaped what Greece became. The isolation of Greece from Africa was not historical. It was invented by scholars who needed Greece to be pure, because they needed Europe to be pure, because they needed racial hierarchy to have a biological foundation, because they needed to justify what was being done to Black people in the Americas and across Africa in the name of civilization. The DNA does not care about any of that. The DNA keeps its own record. The record it keeps in ancient Mycenaean bones and in the genomes of Black Americans alive today shows two populations whose deepest paternal ancestry converges on the same continent, the same ancient region, the same man, 35,000 years before any of the politics began. That is what erases everything history taught us. Not a political argument, not a claim about racial identity. A data point, a haplogroup divergence date, an East African ancestor with two sets of descendants, separated by tens of thousands of years of geography and history, brought back into contact by the most violent economic system in modern history, and now finally recognized as related by the same science that was once used to deny that relationship entirely. History told us that ancient Greece was the origin point, pure, European, untouched, owing nothing to Africa. The DNA says the origin is older than Greece by tens of thousands of years. The origin is in Africa, And the people who were enslaved, stripped of their history, told they had no past worth knowing, told their civilization began only when European ships arrived to claim them. Those people were, all along, carrying in their Y chromosomes the sister lineage of the civilization their enslavers claimed as the foundation of everything they valued. The bones don't lie, the genome doesn't forget, and the deeper you look into the ancient DNA, bone by bone, haplogroup by haplogroup, generation by generation, the more clearly you can see that the attempt to build a permanent wall between Black history and Western civilization's origins was never grounded in biology. It was never grounded in the evidence. It was grounded in power. And power, unlike haplogroups, does not survive forever. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Drop a comment below. Tell us what landed hardest. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.